I heard rumors about the reserve in our neighborhood being dangerous, and over the years, various crimes had occurred there. But I never truly believed the stories, until that night. I was 14 years old when it all happened. My family lived at the edge of the neighborhood, and our backyard practically connected to a big reserve. Most people didn't like the reserve much. There were rumors about crimes happening there, but I never paid them any mind. It was quiet, peaceful even. I used to take my dog, Max, for walks there almost every evening. The reserve had a small lake. My friends, Ollie and Dean, and I would hike up to a little spot on a hill above the lake on Sunday mornings. We fish, hang out, and just talk. That place felt like ours. It wasn't dangerous to us, just a place to get away. One evening, I was walking Max by the lake. The sun had already set, and the air had that cool, still feeling that comes just before night really takes over. That's when I noticed something strange. Out in the middle of the lake, there was a small kayak. At first, I thought someone was just fishing, but as I watched, I saw the person in the kayak waving to someone on the opposite side of the lake. They were both just dark shapes in the fading light. The guy in the kayak tossed what looked like a large trash bag into the water and started paddling toward the shore, where the other person was digging something into the ground. I didn't know what to think. It looked weird, but I figured it was probably none of my business. Besides, it was getting late, and my parents would be mad if I stayed out much longer, so I tugged Max's leash and headed home. A few days later, I told Ollie and Dean about what I'd seen. They were both on vacation with their families, so we only talked over the phone. Dean, always looking for some kind of adventure, suggested we check it out when he got back. He loved exploring, especially if there was a hint of something unusual. Ollie agreed. It wasn't like we had much else to do. Weeks went by, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. Then, one Tuesday evening, I was walking Max again near the lake when I saw something that made my stomach drop. There were 5 people standing near the same spot. 2 were digging, just like before, while another 2 were dragging a large suitcase onto a kayak. The suitcase was so big the kayak looked like it might tip over. One of the men started arguing with another, pointing at a large black garbage bag. It got pretty heated before a third guy stepped in and calmed them down. They loaded the bag onto the kayak, paddled to the middle of the lake, and dumped it. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking on Max's leash. Then Max barked. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of the evening, it felt like a gunshot. All 5 men stopped what they were doing and turned their flashlights toward me. I froze for a second, then bolted, dragging Max with me. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside my house, breathless and drenched in sweat. When my parents asked what had happened, I lied, saying Max had run off and scared me. I wasn't about to tell them the truth. That night, I called Ollie and Dean. They were freaked out but curious. Dean came up with all sorts of wild theories: drug deals, smuggling, even something darker. Ollie reminded us that kayaking wasn't allowed on that lake. His dad had told him that years ago, something to do with safety regulations. But whatever it was, we all agreed to meet up that Sunday and check it out. Sunday came, and we hiked into the woods with Max leading the way. The 3 of us were excited but nervous too. It was different when you had 2 friends with you, though it was evening, and the sun was almost set. We reached the spot where I had seen the men digging. It was quiet. The ground was hard, and there were no signs of anything suspicious. We even checked the lake, but there was nothing there either. It was dark by then. Just as we were about to leave, we heard something. Footsteps, but not coming from behind us. They were coming from a different direction, deeper in the woods. Panic hit us hard. We weren't alone. Whoever was out there had changed their spot. Dean whispered for us to hurry, and we picked up the pace. The sound of footsteps behind us quickened too, matching our speed. It was like a nightmare. As we scrambled through the woods, Dean suddenly tripped. His leg got stuck in a patch of soft, freshly dug ground. At that moment, Max barked again, louder this time. A flashlight beam swung in our direction, and we saw someone coming toward us. We ran. I didn't even think. I just ran, with Max beside me, pulling me forward. The footsteps behind us grew louder, but we didn't stop until we burst through my back door. We slammed it shut, locking it behind us. My parents were in the kitchen, and when they saw the three of us gasping for air, they knew something was wrong. We told them everything, about the kayak, the trash bags, the suitcases, and the people in the woods. My mom immediately called the police. It felt like hours before the cops showed up, but it was probably just a few minutes. They questioned us, and then went to check the reserve. A few days later, we got the news. The men we had seen were part of a gang, using the reserve to bury drugs and weapons. Worse, the lake held the remains of 6 bodies, along with guns and other evidence of crimes. The story made it into the local news. Everyone in the neighborhood was talking about it. The police told my parents that we should move. There was a chance other gang members might come looking for revenge. At first, my parents brushed it off, thinking it was an overreaction. But then one night, after we came home from visiting my grandmother, we found our house ransacked. Someone had broken in. That was the final straw. We packed up and moved within a week, leaving the house and the reserve behind. I didn't miss it. Now, at 35, I recently lost my dad. While going through some of his old things, I found a newspaper clipping about the incident. It all came rushing back. I hadn't thought about that night in years, but seeing the article stirred up memories I had buried. I had never told anyone else about what happened, not even my wife, but I decided to share it here. It wasn't an accident that I got lost. It was a trap from the beginning. I'm not exactly a survivalist, but I've been into fitness for as long as I can remember. I've spent the last 10 years practically living in the gym, and recently, I got into hiking. It started as a way to break the monotony of lifting weights and running on a treadmill. Over the last 2 or 3 years, I've hiked nearly every major and minor national park in the US, but after a while, those trails started to feel a bit too predictable. I found myself craving something more intense, more thrilling. That's when I stumbled across this YouTube video that gave me an idea. It was a trick some guy used to make sure he didn't get lost. He would leave little marks on trees as he went. But here's the thing, the marks couldn't be anything that looked natural. They had to stand out. This guy used a small star-shaped metal pipe to carve into the trees. I thought it was genius and started doing the same. It worked like a charm every time. I'd mark trees far enough apart so I'd never lose sight of the path. No chance of walking in circles. Everything else? It was just experience and instinct. But after a while, I needed more. The familiar trails and national parks didn't give me that adrenaline rush anymore. I wanted isolation, danger. The gym had become boring, and even the wilds of America weren't cutting it. So, I decided to take it up a notch, head to the Amazon rainforest. Lucky for me, my college buddy Jimmy was working there on some conservation project involving Orao turtles. We hadn't seen each other in a few years, but we stayed in touch. As soon as I told him my plan to hike through the rainforest, he tried to talk me out of it. "The Amazon isn't some national park," he said. "People die out there, man." But knowing me and my stubbornness, he eventually gave in. Jimmy knew I was experienced and had prepared for everything, so he gave me his blessing, in a way, and I booked my flight. Jimmy picked me up when I landed. The reunion was great, lots of reminiscing and catching up. He filled me in on the work he was doing with turtles, which was fascinating, though not really my thing. When I mentioned my plan to hike an isolated part of the rainforest, he told me about one such area that his team hadn't checked in over a month. "It's dangerous," he said. I brushed it off. Eventually, he relented. He helped me with the logistics, what to pack, what to expect, how to stay safe. I memorized the route, made sure I had everything I needed, and planned to set off early the next day. I started at 7 a.m., intending to be back by 2 p.m. at the latest. It was supposed to be a short, 2-hour hike. The air was thick with humidity, and the forest felt alive in ways that were both exciting and a little unnerving. But for the first hour, everything went according to plan. I left my marks on the trees, carefully placing them on small, young saplings so they wouldn't be mistaken for anything else. By the second hour, though, I started feeling off. It was like I'd been walking longer than expected, and when I finally checked my watch, I couldn't believe it. I'd been hiking for 4 hours. The dense foliage, the sounds of insects, and the thick air made it hard to think straight. Worse still, nothing looked familiar, and the scenery hadn't changed like Jimmy described. The terrain was supposed to get marshier, the humidity heavier. But I wasn't seeing any of that. I turned to look behind me. My marks were still there, right where they should be. I figured I must have just been slow, maybe because of the heat or the thick undergrowth. So I pushed on. Then I saw it, a massive log, the same one I had passed at least 6 times already. My heart dropped. I was walking in circles. But that didn't make sense. I had marked the trees perfectly. I was sure of it. This wasn't some rookie mistake. I started retracing my steps, looking at the marks I had left. That's when things got even stranger. I saw the familiar star-shaped cuts, but something was off. The marks were on big trees, not the small ones I'd originally used. And they weren't as deep. Someone had copied my marks. That's when it hit me. Someone was messing with me. Panic started to creep in, but I fought to stay calm. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. So I did what anyone would. I tried to get to higher ground. If I could get a signal, I could call Jimmy. Maybe he'd send help or at least guide me back. But the forest was dense, and every step felt like it was leading me further into some maze. After what felt like hours, I saw the marks again. The same fake ones, placed just right so that if I was tired or distracted, I'd think I was on the right path. I stood there, staring at them, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Someone was watching me, tracking my every move. I scanned the forest, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. No rustling leaves, no cracking branches. Just the eerie, oppressive silence of the jungle. I decided to ignore the marks and go in the opposite direction, hoping it would throw off whoever was playing these sick games. That's when I heard it, a growl, deep and guttural, from somewhere in the distance. I froze. The Amazon wasn't exactly known for being predator-free. Jaguars, large snakes, everything ran through my mind at once. But I wasn't about to stand still and wait to find out what it was. I changed direction, walking faster. The growl came again, from a different direction. And again, when I changed course. It didn't take long to realize the truth. There wasn't a predator hunting me. Someone was making those sounds, trying to scare me off or mess with me even more. The fear was turning into anger. Who was doing this? Why? I wasn't going to let some psycho push me around, not in the middle of the jungle, not when I was this close to losing it. I kept moving, this time straight toward the sound. If they wanted to play games, I was done. Whatever waited ahead, I was going to face it head on. The forest began to change after that. The air got heavier, more humid. The ground became marshy, and small shrubs began to appear, just like Jimmy had described. I was on the right track now, finally out of that mental maze. But something kept nagging at me. Why had someone been trying to keep me away from this area? The higher ground eventually opened into a clearing, and that's when I saw it, a small, run-down cabin, barely visible through the dense vegetation. Traps were scattered everywhere around it, poacher traps, the kind meant for animals, or people. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just some random prank. I had walked into a poacher's territory. Despite every instinct telling me to turn around and run, I stayed. Then the rain started pouring, and the thought of getting drenched without shelter made the decision for me. I went inside the cabin. It was worse than I expected. The place was a disaster. Rusted cages, guns, lavish hiker's gear, and turtle shells stacked in piles. The poachers weren't just killing animals, they were taking trophies. And judging by the state of things, they'd been here for a while. I pulled out my phone and finally had a signal. I called Jimmy, my hands shaking. "Get out of there," he said immediately. "They're dangerous. You need to leave. Now." and keep moving to avoid getting caught. But it wasn't that easy. The rain was coming down harder, and whoever had been tracking me was likely watching the cabin. Jimmy told me he'd send a rescue team, but it would take at least 2 hours. I bolted out of the cabin, my heart pounding. The rain made the forest even harder to navigate. I could barely see, and every step felt like I was sinking deeper into the muck. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I could hear something behind me, footsteps. I couldn't be sure. But I kept moving, slipping and sliding through the mud, the rain soaking me to the bone. It felt like I'd been running for hours when I finally saw a figure in the distance. Jimmy. He and the rescue team had arrived just in time. It's been 3 months since that day, and Jimmy called me last week with news. They caught the poachers. Turns out, they'd been responsible for the deaths of multiple hikers, stealing their gear, and slaughtering dozens of endangered animals. I was lucky to be alive. The only reason I made it out. I was too big for the lone poacher to handle. He'd been waiting for his friends to show up before making a move. It was pure luck that I survived. It was the worst hiking experience of my life. To this day, I still can't believe I made it out alive. At the time, I was 40 years old and going through a rough patch in my life. I'd just gone through a brutal divorce, and to make matters worse, I'd lost custody of my 6-year-old daughter, Hannah, to my ex-wife. I wasn't in a good place, mentally or emotionally. I needed an escape, and that's when I got the idea to go hiking. I live in Washington, and the North Cascades National Park is pretty close to where I am. It's beautiful, secluded, and massive, perfect for what I had in mind. I wasn't planning to hike on the marked trails. Where's the fun in that? I figured if I could lose myself in the wilderness, maybe I'd find some kind of peace. I packed my bags, threw some essentials into my truck, a Toyota Tacoma that had been through a lot with me over the years, and by 11 a.m., I was on the road. The plan was to drive as deep into the woods as I could, park the truck somewhere hidden, and hike off-road. No marked trails, no reservations, no people. Just me and the forest. My buddy Matt, who owns a small repair shop, had hiked through the area before, and he told me about the trail. But even he warned me that it wasn't smart to go off the trails. I wasn't in the mood for advice. After driving about 9 or 10 miles deep into the forest, navigating rough, uneven terrain, I found a spot that looked good. I parked the truck under some trees, covered it with branches and leaves to hide it, then grabbed my gear. I had a tent, a sleeping bag, some snacks, and a steak I was planning to cook over a fire later that night. I started walking, looking for a place to set up camp. It was getting close to sunset, so I didn't want to wander for too long. After a few miles, I found a small clearing surrounded by trees. I dropped my gear there, thinking I'd come back to set up my tent after grabbing the rest of my stuff from the truck. When I got back to the truck, I grabbed the firewood and the steak. As I made my way back to the clearing, it was starting to get dark. By the time I reached the spot where I'd left my gear, something felt off. I looked around, confused. My bag of snacks was missing. At first, I thought I might have left it in the truck, but I knew I hadn't. I had brought it with me. I stood there for a moment, scanning the trees, trying to figure out what happened. A chill crept up my spine, but I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just a raccoon or something. I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. I still had the steak, and that was the important part. I started setting up my tent, but as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The usual sounds of the forest at night, the wind rustling the leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, felt louder than usual, almost amplified. But that was part of the reason I'd come out here. The adrenaline helped me focus on something other than my misery, so I pushed through it. With the tent set up, I got a fire going and started cooking my steak. The sizzle of the meat was comforting. The smell filled the air, and I started to relax. But then nature called, and I had to step away from the camp. I figured the fire would keep any animals away from the steak, so I wasn't too worried. I walked a short distance into the trees, did my business, and when I turned to head back, I heard a noise. Something rustling in the bushes near my camp. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed my knife and rushed back to the fire, ready to scare off whatever was lurking. But when I got there, I froze. The steak was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty spot where it had been just moments before. No signs of any struggle, no tracks. Nothing. Just an empty fire pit and a rising sense of dread. I scanned the area with my flashlight, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had taken my food. Maybe a dog or a bear, I thought. But there was nothing. The fire crackled, and the woods around me were eerily still. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. I tried to calm myself down, reasoning that it had to be some animal. This was the wilderness, after all. I was in their territory. Still, I couldn't shake the unease creeping over me. Hungry and frustrated, I crawled into my tent, clutching my knife. I pulled out my phone, hoping to distract myself with pictures of Hannah. She looked so happy in those photos, her bright eyes full of joy. I missed her more than anything, and the pain of being separated from her was suffocating me. I lay there, tears in my eyes, and I drifted off to sleep. But that sleep didn't last long. A loud snap jolted me awake in the middle of the night. It sounded like a branch breaking, close by, too close. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my phone, but when I pressed the power button, nothing happened. The battery was dead. I grabbed my knife, listening for any signs of movement outside the tent. The forest had gone completely silent, which only made my fear worse. I sat there for what felt like hours, clutching the knife, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal again. Maybe whatever had stolen my steak had come back. I let out a shaky breath and stepped out of the tent to relieve myself. As I walked back toward the fire, I heard rustling in the bushes again. My heart leapt into my throat as I shined the flashlight in the direction of the noise. What I saw froze me in place. There, hiding behind the trees, were 5 men. They were dressed in filthy, torn clothes, each one holding a knife. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes wide and wild. I couldn't move. My mind went blank as I locked eyes with one of them. Then, instinct kicked in. I turned and bolted toward my truck, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I could hear them chasing me, their footsteps pounding behind me. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, my lungs burning as I tore through the forest. The truck wasn't far, but in that moment, it felt like miles away. Finally, I reached it. I threw open the door, jumped inside, and fumbled with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped off, but after only a few hundred feet, the truck lurched to a stop. The tires were spinning, but the truck wasn't moving. I got out and looked down. Each tire had been shredded, deep cuts running through the rubber. My heart sank as the realization hit me. They had sabotaged my truck. They'd been watching me the whole time, waiting for me to make a mistake. I was stranded, miles from the nearest road, with no phone, no signal, and no way to get out. I wasn't sure what these men wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next, but nothing made sense. I couldn't call the police, not with the false assault charges hanging over my head from the divorce. Even if I wanted to, there was no signal out here. That night, I sat in the truck, cold, hungry, and terrified. What if those men found me? Every decision I had made leading up to this moment replayed in my head. I cursed myself for not turning back when I first noticed the missing snacks, for ignoring the signs that something wasn't right. By 4 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my backpack and started walking. The forest was deathly quiet, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I walked for hours, my legs aching, my mind racing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I found a spot where my phone picked up a signal. I called Matt. He arrived with a gun and 4 new tires. We didn't say much on the drive back, the weight of what had happened hanging heavy between us. Since that day, I haven't set foot in the woods. I haven't told anyone about what happened except for Matt.